So now that we have discussed the major concepts associated with social psychology, such as conformity, compliance, and obedience, we can start looking at how those topics or those concepts apply towards cases like the Jonestown Massacre. So the Jonestown Massacre was a mass suicide of over 900 people that took place in 1978. It is commonly understood as a religious cult led by a man named Jim Jones. The church was based on Christianity and was based originally in San Francisco, but the church grew in size and became very wealthy and had many, as you can see, devoted followers. And Jim Jones actually decided to move the congregation to Guyana, which is in South America. And his reasons were that he wanted to establish a very private community, a commune essentially, somewhere where they could be free to practice their religion and be completely devoted to their religion. And as you can see, so many people were completely devoted to this man that they went to Guyana with him. They left behind their lives and their jobs, and many of them took their families with them. But how do we get someone to do all of that? I guess how did he manage to do all of that? It didn't happen overnight. And what's important to understand is that this religious organization, or this cult, if you want to call it that, I think that's a safe descriptor, they use a lot of the same practices, they use a lot of the same techniques, compliance techniques that other organizations use, whether those organizations be religious or educational or political. But again, it doesn't really necessarily become an issue until the organization is taking advantage of the individual, and of course, making them do things that are harmful to themselves or others. So the door in the face technique, this is a compliance technique in which we start with a large request, and when the individual says no to this, we basically follow up with a smaller request. And this seems to be an effective strategy because the smaller request, when it's presented subsequently after a larger request, it seems that much smaller in comparison as opposed to if it was just standing alone. So for example, if they had not asked people for monetary donations first and just immediately asked people to come inside and help the church for 5 minutes, that in itself would seem like a large favor or a large request. But because it's preceded by a request for monetary donations, it seems smaller by comparison. The foot in the door technique is a compliance technique in which we capitalize off a compliance or agreement to a smaller request and follow that up with a larger request. And so after an individual says yes to a request, we basically add on to that request. That allows us to present a second larger request, and the chances of that second larger request being granted when paired with a smaller request is much greater than if it was presented alone, because people tend to be consistent in their actions. That's the explanation that social psychologists have offered. And as you can see, when people start donating to a church, oftentimes their donations become larger and they ask for larger donations. And as you can see in the case of Jim Jones, he ultimately asked them for a lot, and they were willing to give him a lot, but they were only willing to give him a lot because in part they had already given him so much. They'd already done so many other smaller things. Normative and informational social influence, conformity, can also be said to have been a factor in this mass suicide, or even just being a member in this church. I think that when individuals are new to a group, they're much more likely to conform to the norms and the behaviors of those groups. And those norms might be attendance to religious services. It might be the amount of money that they donate to the religious organization. It might be the amount of time they spend at the religious organization. It might be the way that they communicate to the leader of the organization. And so whether or not they do that because they lack information or because they're trying trying to follow the group norm as a result of real or perceived pressure, either way it's going to fall under conformity. Anytime an individual is influenced by a larger group, that is an example of conformity. There are many other ways that groups can influence us. We're going to look at now social facilitation, social loafing, the bystander effect, de-individuation, and group polarization. So social facilitation is a term that's used to describe how the presence of other individuals causes physiological arousal. So first of all, what is physiological arousal? That's going to have to do with an increased heart rate, elevated breathing, dilated pupils, essentially the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And so what we see is that when individuals are in crowds, if an individual is in a crowded grocery store, if an individual is in a crowded amphitheater, a crowded subway, they're more likely to have this elevated physiological arousal. And what we see is that if they have an elevated physiological arousal due to the presence of other people, and they have to perform a task, whether it be teaching or dancing or singing, what we see is that for simple or very well learned tasks that they have practiced or rehearsed many times, we see that that physiological arousal actually leads to confidence, excitement, and overall good performance. However, if the individual is attempting to perform a complex or unlearned or very poorly trained task, let's say this is the first time they play in a basketball game. This is the very first time the coach puts them in the sport. This is the very first time that they have to perform a solo and they haven't been practicing very much. This can lead to a lot of anxiety, obviously, and of course subsequently bad performance as well. And that's one of the reasons why professional athletes often set records at the actual event and the competition as opposed to during practice and training. When they're practicing and training, even though they might be practiced or giving forth all of their effort, the fact that there's no one around cheering or applauding and there's not thousands of eyes looking at them, that actually is a disservice to them. Once those things happen, once those things are present, that actually elevates their physiological arousal and elevates their performance. Think of it like social caffeine, if you will. Social loafing is a phenomenon in which people tend to exert less effort when working as a group than when individually accountable. This is one of the reasons why many people don't enjoy working in groups, is because of social loafing. So in theory, what happens is that when a group of people are assigned a task, they do not feel as if they are 100% responsible for the outcome of the task, and so therefore they are less likely to exert 100% effort. This is known as diffusion of responsibility. So the more people that are involved in the task, the more diffused the responsibility is, which is why it's very important when working in groups to delegate tasks, so that way each member of the group is completely responsible for one task in particular, and then so they will basically have 100% of their responsibility falling on a very well-defined specific task. The better you can define a group member's task, the more likely they are going to complete that task and perform it to their best ability. What we see with diffusion of responsibility is that it has implications in emergency situations. Imagine being in a crowded restaurant and somebody yells, "Someone call 911." Now compare that to a situation in which it's only you and two other people, and one of the three people is experiencing a health situation, and the second person says, "Call the police." Or let's say for the sake of, I guess, making it a little bit more comparable, maybe a group of 4 people. So in the restaurant we have 50 people. There's an accident and someone's having a heart failure, and one person is checking on them and says to the other 48 people, "Someone call an ambulance." what do you think the odds are of you calling the ambulance? Well, the truth is that, I mean, whatever 100 divided by 48 is, something about like 2%. You're really only like 2% responsible for calling 911. Whereas if it's a small group of 4 people and one of them has a health condition and one of them is attending to the person having a health condition, and they look at the other 2 people and say, hey, someone call 911. Well, it's only you and one other person standing there. So in theory, you're 50% likely to call 911, which is much higher compared to the other situation. So the woman pictured here, her name's Kitty Genovese. In 1964, she was brutally attacked outside of her apartment in New York City, and she was screaming for help, and many people heard her scream for help, but no one called the police, because everyone basically felt as if there was a good chance that someone else was going to call the police, and maybe didn't necessarily feel like it was their complete responsibility. They didn't necessarily feel bad about not calling the police because they probably figured that someone else did or someone else would. And that's known as the bystander effect. We as individuals have personalities. We have problem-solving skills. We have a certain level of intelligence, we have a certain level of extroversion, and a certain level of neuroticism. What ends up happening, though, is that if we become members of a group, even more so a large group, even more so a group in which we have anonymity, basically we are able to disguise ourselves with a mask, or we're wearing a uniform that's the same as everyone else's and we kind of blend in with the crowd. That is known as de-individuation. And the more we become part of the crowd, the less of an individual we become. And so when we see riots and mobs all acting in a very violent, aggressive way, we do have individuals acting violently, but the theory behind why they are more likely to do this as a part of a group as opposed to themselves is because much of their identity of how they perceive themselves is lost once they adopt status as part of the group. And so being a member of a gang or a hate group or a mob, or even a sports team. I mean, when you only have a uniform in common with everyone else, and your face is covered, you're much more likely to act unlike yourself, which is one of the reasons why we see people wearing when people wear masks on Halloween, or they dress up for an event that involves a mask, they might be acting a little bit different than they normally would. If you think back to movies like The Purge, where everyone seems to be covering their face when they're engaging in these mass murders, and so in theory, part of what gives them the quote-unquote courage to do that is going to be the de-individuation process, becoming less like an individual and more like a member of the group. Group polarization is a concept that describes what happens when individuals only interact, or most of their interaction is only with people who think like them. And so the cartoon on the bottom shows how over time politics in the United States of America become very divided, and it seems that the division has, or the conflict has forced us to separate from each other and view the other side as an enemy. And what's important to understand is that it only gets worse and worse and worse over time, and only becomes more divided over time, because the more that we identify with a particular group, and the less we associate with another group, the group that we're a part of is going to constantly validate or confirm our opinions, our beliefs, not just about the other group, but also other ideas, politics, political viewpoints. And so what ends up happening is, if an individual only associates with people who match their political ideology, that's essentially how extremism is bred. So it's important to expose yourself to all different types of opinions. Otherwise, you become very fixated in a party's opinions or a religious group's opinions. How we think about our own and others' behavior. So this will be the last section in chapter 9. We'll be talking about attributions, which we discussed in with regard to personality, but we're going to discuss them, how they apply to social psychology, and then role playing as well. So attributions are how we explain the behavior of ourselves and others. In personality, we look more about how we make attributions for our own behavior. With social psychology, we look more at how we make attributions towards other people's behaviors. And so remember that internal attributions are based on a person's internal traits or characteristics, things like their intelligence, their personality, their decision making, their attitudes, their beliefs, their opinions, those kinds of things. All those things that make up the identity of the individual. External attributions involve social structures like friends or family or the neighborhood or a situation or a circumstance like a pandemic, for example. So for example, let's say a student is performing poorly in the fall semester of 2020, and why are they performing poorly? Is it because they are not a good student? And so not a good student, that would be an internal attribution. Or is it because they're being forced to take online classes due to the pandemic, and that's not really their strength? That would be an external attribution. Is it possible that the truth is the internal attribution? I suppose it is possible. Maybe they were a bad student before the pandemic, and they'll be a bad student after the pandemic, and they're a bad student, in face-to-face classes as well. But maybe they're typically a good student, and it's just they're struggling with the online transition. Well, we as humans have a tendency to make internal rather than external attributions for negative circumstances of others. This is known as the fundamental attribution error. So fundamental means basic. Attribution is an explanation for someone's behavior, and it's a basic mistake that we make. It's very easy to make internal attributions for an individual's failures. One of the reasons is the just world hypothesis. And so the just world hypothesis is the premise or the belief that the world is fair and people get what they deserve. So look at the people, to try to prove this point a little bit better, maybe let's switch away from a student doing poorly in class to something a little bit more extreme or serious, someone being in prison. Why are these people in prison? Are they in prison because they're bad people and they make bad decisions and they make bad choices? Maybe. Are they in prison because they were born into poverty and had terrible parents and maybe got harshly sentenced, unfairly sentenced? Maybe they have a mental health issue. Why was the individual in the previous picture homeless? Is it because he's lazy and he doesn't want to work, or because he has a mental health issue? What happens when we find out that the individual is a veteran? Is it impossible? Is it possible for someone to be lazy and not want to work and still and also be a veteran? I suppose it is. But at this point now, maybe we're considering that the system has failed him, and so it's no longer his fault that he's homeless. It's no longer these people's fault that they're homeless because, or these people are in prison. It's not necessarily or completely their fault because they had a bad upbringing. They had bad friends who poorly influenced them. They never had any good teachers, that kind of stuff like that. I don't know. The truth of the matter is that we don't see any of that other stuff. When we look at a picture of people in orange jumpsuits, all we see is them locked up for something that we believe that we assume that they did. And again, we want to believe that the world is fair and people get what they deserve. But we don't see the tour of Iraq. We don't see the abusive parents that they might have had. And so that is actor-observer bias. As the observer, it's very difficult to see those external attributions. All we see is the individual. But what's really interesting is that as the actor, when we're trying to explain our negative situations and our failures, we don't really have a mirror in front of us all the time. So it's very easy to consider other factors that are leading to our failure. The truth is that it's likely a combination of both internal and external attributions. And so I think that it's just important that we try to consider external attributions when trying to explain a person's situation, and make the conscious effort to consider that, even if it means asking them about those things, because without knowing that information, all we have to go on is them being in a bad situation. The last thing we'll talk about is role playing. Philip Zimbardo is probably considered one of the most famous and renowned and cited social psychologist. He was very famous for a mock prison study that he created at Stanford University. It was a mock prison study, and so he basically had students be randomly assigned to the role of guards, and students be randomly assigned to the role of prisoners. And there's a couple of pictures there on the bottom left. What ended up happening is that just after a few days, some of the prisoners started feeling intense anxiety. They felt trapped. They felt like they were really in a prison. They felt like they couldn't leave, when the truth of the matter is that all they had to do was ask to leave. But because they were given this role of being a prisoner, they adopted all of the essentially emotions that go along with being someone who's being held captive against their will, even though they technically weren't, because obviously that would be illegal to hold a student in the basement of the psychology building against their will. And the guards, on the other hand, they didn't have any problem. In fact, they really enjoyed their jobs, and they actually became a little bit too aggressive. And so things got pretty chaotic. The prisoners started rioting, and there was big altercations between the guards and the prisoners because, again, they formed different groups. And going back to conformity, if you're a prisoner, are you going to be associated with guards? You're going to be associated with prisoners. You're going to associate with your group members, and vice versa. And then you have group polarization. The longer that you associate with your group, the more likely you're going to start to see the other group as the enemy. So what constitutes abuse of power? Because that's the whole thing that Philip Zimbardo was trying to understand. When individuals adopt the role of authority, like a guard or a police officer or a teacher even, or a priest, what constitutes abuse of power? So there's all sorts of really, really traumatic videos. In fact, I probably don't even encourage you to watch them, that are linked there. These are videos of police officers that are abusing their power. And what have we learned from, the basic ideas of social psychology, like conformity and obedience to authority? So first of all, with regard to conformity, when police officers identify as police officers and they see everyone else wearing the same uniform as them, they are going to form a group, and it's very difficult to turn on your group, essentially, to be a nonconformist. And what does a nonconformist look like in a police department, a police officer? Well, it's someone who sides with the people who are being arrested. I mean, that's pretty much as simple as I can say it. And so, as a police officer, would you be willing to stand up for someone being arrested and stand up against one of your group members or your peers, your colleagues, your brothers, even they call themselves, and tell them, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and I'm actually going to side with the person that you're arresting, and what you're doing to them is abuse. That's essentially being a nonconformist. The lecture here of The Psychology of Evil by Philip Zimbardo explains how all of these different concepts that we've discussed influence social psychology and how they influence war and policing and being a guard and a prisoner. It has consequences. The roles that we adopt, whether it's teacher, student, doctor, lawyer, mom. All of these are roles that carry weight with them. So I encourage you to certainly watch the Psychology of Evil video. So with regards to the other videos of police officers abusing their authority, it's 2020. You probably have seen these videos that are linked or others, and so there's many of them out there, and it just makes you wonder, what is it going to take? What kind of reform is it going to take in order to, I guess, alleviate some of these symptoms of abuse of power? So that's all we have for social psychology. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Have a good day.